That morning, Julia's world came to an end. The white dress still carried the scent of the party, and the clock marked the exact moment when innocence ceased to exist. She woke up in an unfamiliar bed, surrounded by luxury silence, and a man who dictated his own fate. From today on, you are my wife. The room seemed to breathe. Heavy curtains allowed thin, respectful rays of light to enter, as if afraid to disturb the stillness that ruled the place. The air smelled of expensive flowers, something sacred and sinful at the same time. Julia Marino awoke with her heart tight and her body too light against silk sheets. Time felt suspended, and she couldn't remember how she'd gotten there. The clock ticked indifferently, detached from what was happening. She blinked slowly, trying to gather her thoughts. Her last memory still tasted like the sweetness of her 21st birthday party, Aunt Elena's laughter, the sparkle of champagne glasses. Then nothing. And now everything. Luxury, silence, fear. And standing before her was the man who turned rumors into truths and enemies into ghosts, Lorenzo Vitali. He stood there, calm, like someone who controlled other people's destinies. The black suit seemed to be made of shadow, and his eyes, cold, deep, almost merciful, trapped the air in her chest. From today on, you are my wife, he said. No emotion, no hesitation, just a sentence. On the table, a document with her signature, perfect, alive, and false. The paper seemed to smile, and she could feel her own name becoming a prison. The sound of rain against the stained glass echoed the quiet despair growing inside her. Julia looked around. Golden columns, polished furniture, beauty sharp enough to hurt. Everything seemed like an ancient play, and she was just another character. The doors opened, and elegant figures entered with cold eyes. Men of power. Women who wore perfume like a weapon. Witnesses of a ritual without love. Lorenzo lifted his chin and spoke without raising his voice. My property. The words were heavy, yet his tone was almost gentle, which made it worse. Julia didn't answer. Her throat burned, her body trembled, but her eyes remained steady. Inside her something flickered, a small, stubborn flame. It was fear, yes, but it was also pride. The notary spoke of clauses, dates, and seals, a voice carved from stone. No one listened, but everyone knew. That marriage wasn't built on love, it was built on power. Julia kept her head high, even as her heart screamed. She wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the marble floor. The rings were placed. Cold, without a proposal, without choice. The gold felt like melting ice against her skin. For a moment his gaze softened. Maybe it was an illusion, maybe compassion. Julia couldn't tell. There was something familiar there, like a faint echo, as if she had seen that look before, in another time, another life. But then he turned away, and the cold returned. The moment vanished, swallowed by formality. Outside, thunder. Inside, broken promises. She thought of Aunt Elena, her tense smile the night before, her rushed, vague words. Everything will change, Julia. Trust me. Trust. A beautiful word, now empty. The betrayal didn't yet have a name, but it already had weight. Every detail of that party now felt like a disguised farewell. The girl who blew out her candles hadn't known she was lighting her own hell. A toast rang out, and the crystal glasses clashed like chains. Lorenzo kept his eyes on her the whole time, as if studying an enemy he didn't yet understand. A queen doesn't cry, he murmured, just for her. It wasn't comfort, it was a command. Julia swallowed her reply, but inside something began to rise. Queen. The word echoed and stayed. Maybe it wasn't an insult. Maybe it was a warning. The hall seemed to breathe with the couple. Every guest pretended to celebrate, but fear moved quietly between the glasses. Julia felt every gaze like a blade. Some wanted to see her fall. Others only wanted to witness the spectacle. She smiled, faint, bitter. And in that small gesture, something shifted. It wasn't surrender, It was the first act of resistance. Lorenzo raised his glass. The champagne fizzed, but his voice was flat, emotionless. To the new Mrs. Vitali. Laughter followed and music resumed, but the air stayed heavy. Julia looked out the window, at the rain falling over Rome. Each drop seemed to whisper, "You're still breathing." And for now that was enough. She didn't know how, but something inside her promised. The day will come when this name won't be a chain. It will be a throne. The ring was heavy, the dress suffocating, but something new pulsed between the lines of fear. Julia knew the nightmare was only beginning. And even without knowing why, a voice whispered inside her, maybe destiny, maybe her own soul. One day you'll return every wound with power. Silence returned, the door closed. Lorenzo watched her from a distance, like someone recognizing something too dangerous to touch. The world around them faded to grey, but her eyes stayed alive. The forced marriage was sealed. What he didn't know was that he had just tied his empire to the strength of someone time itself could never break. The sun rose dull that morning. The tall mansion windows let in a pale light that seemed to observe without caring. Julia woke to the faint sound of footsteps, echoes repeating like memories. The bed was too big, the sheets too heavy, and the silence, almost cruel. She realized that even though she was free to walk, she was already trapped. The nightmare began not with screams, but with their absence. Lorenzo was gone. Only his scent remained, a woody fragrance that blended power and danger. Julia rose slowly, her bare feet touching the cold floor. With every step she felt the invisible weight of the walls. The house seemed to watch her. Everything there had a soul. Eyes, paintings, servants, corridors. Every glance reminded her she didn't even own her own breath. A maid entered quietly, carrying a new dress. Black, elegant, like disguised mourning. "The boss asked that you get ready," she said, without meeting Julia's eyes. Julia wanted to ask for what, but the answer was already in the air. Her fate didn't need to be explained, only obeyed. She dressed herself as if putting on armor. The mirror reflected a woman she didn't yet recognize. In the hall, men in suits and women with fake laughter awaited her. The crystal glasses caught the golden lights, and the music was far too graceful for what was truly happening. Julia was introduced as Mrs. Vitali. The title felt like iron on her skin. Every greeting came with a hint of disdain. She was the trophy, the mark of possession, the newest piece of the empire. Lorenzo arrived last, impeccable. The silence that followed his entrance said everything. He didn't need to announce himself. Power did that for him. He walked toward Julia, placed a hand on her shoulder, and simply said, "Smile." The tone wasn't gentle. It was strategic. And she obeyed. That smile became the first lie she learnt to wear in order to survive. The guests measured her as if calculating the worth of a stolen diamond. The women whispered. The men laughed with mockery. She kept her gaze steady, even as humiliation burned under her skin. The sound of toast disguised the sharp words hidden between lines. The criminal elite thrived on other people's discomfort. And now, Julia was the feast. Lorenzo spoke little, but every gesture said more than words. He watched her, studied her every reaction. The predator testing its prey, or maybe the king judging if the queen was worthy of the throne. Julia didn't look away. Inside her, fear was slowly giving way to a calm, almost cold anger, the kind of anger that builds empires in silence. She tried to remember who she had been before all this. Tried to hear her own voice, but the music, the laughter, the glint of gold drowned everything out. Before she knew it, she was smiling automatically, like a puppet trained to please. And in that moment she understood, the worst kind of prison is the one that makes the prisoner look happy. When the party ended, Lorenzo led her to the car. The driver opened the door, and the night wind carried the scent of rain over Rome. He said, without looking at her, "Get used to it. They're always watching." And that was it. No touch, no affection, just a warning. In his world, even love was surveillance. On the way back, the city lights drifted by like ghosts. Julia stared out the window, seeing her own reflection, caught between fear and something new, unnamed, maybe pride. Maybe the first spark of rebellion. Her heart no longer beat to the rhythm of the night before. Back at the mansion, the sound of her heels echoed across the marble floor, a small sound that somehow carried promises. Lorenzo stood with his back to her, pouring whiskey. "You behaved well," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. Julia didn't reply. She simply walked to the window, where the city slept beneath the rain. "You kidnapped me," she whispered, barely realizing she'd said it. He stepped closer but didn't touch her. "I gave you a name," he replied coldly. Julia laughed silently, a laugh no one could hear. The name was his, not hers, but still, it was something, the beginning of something Lorenzo couldn't yet understand. Rebellion can bloom even under a mourning dress. In the days that followed, the nightmare took shape. She was watched constantly, even inside her own home. The maids never spoke, the guards never blinked. Lorenzo's world was built on silence and blind loyalty. Julia searched for cracks, glances, gestures, half-open doors. Every step became an invisible battle. During one meeting, Lorenzo officially introduced her to the family council. Julia stood behind him like a shadow, but she saw everything. The men discussed territories, debts, weapons. She stayed quiet, memorizing every word. Fear was slowly turning into understanding. Knowing your enemy is the first step to defeating him. At night, when everyone slept, Julia wandered through the corridors, touching the walls as if tracing a map of a labyrinth. The distant ticking of a clock marked time with cruelty. She thought about running, but she knew it wasn't time yet. Not yet. Destiny has a fondness for patience. Once she overheard Lorenzo on the phone. His voice was lower, almost human. He spoke of losses, promises, and regrets. Julia stopped on the staircase, listening to fragments. There was pain hidden under the iron. A past he tried to bury, but that still breathed. And for the first time, she felt something that wasn't only hatred. The next morning he left early. On the table he'd placed a jewelry box. An expensive gift, no note. Julia opened it and found an old necklace. Not gold, but silver. Simple, delicate, as if it belonged to another time. She didn't understand the gesture, but she felt something behind it, something Lorenzo didn't say out loud. The mirror reflected her face again, the same eyes, but steadier now. The nightmare wasn't destroying her. It was shaping her, turning fear into control. Deep down she knew pain can be a strange kind of power. And Julia was learning fast. Outside, the rain began again. Between the sound of the drops and the silence of the house, she felt that fate hadn't finished writing her story. Hell had many doors, and she had just learned how to open the first one. Night fell over Rome like a heavy mantle. The city lights reflected on the mansion's glass, and Julia, standing by the window, saw only her own reflection. The face was the same, but something in her eyes had changed. Fear still lived there, but now it shared space with something new, a quiet spark burning deep inside. The time for silence was ending. The next day, Lorenzo called her to a meeting. He said he needed her for a test. The words sounded simple, but the tone carried something deeper. Destiny, she thought, often begins with short sentences. Julia got into the car without asking questions. The city rushed by in grey blurs, her heartbeat caught somewhere between anger and curiosity. The car stopped in front of an old warehouse near the port. The air smelled of rust and oil, mixed with the damp wind of the sea. Armed men watched as Lorenzo spoke little. "You'll pick up a package," he said without looking at her. His voice was neutral, but when their eyes met, it was like he could see right through her soul. Julia crossed the warehouse with steady steps. The sound of her heels echoed like defiance. The men's gazes followed her, mocking, whispering. One of them, with a crooked smile, came too close. The boss's wife. Must be nice being a prisoner in style, he sneered. The words dripped with venom. She stopped. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, fear wanted to return. But Julia was no longer the same. She turned slowly, looked the man straight in the eyes, and said coldly, "Next time you talk to me, you'll be on your knees." The words left her lips sharp and clean, effortless. Silence fell like a blade, and for the first time she tasted power. The man gave a short, nervous laugh and stepped back. Lorenzo watched from a distance, not interfering. It wasn't approval, it was a test. He wanted to see how far she would go. And she went all the way. She grabbed the package, walked up to him, and handed it over without looking away. "Here's what you asked for." A simple phrase, but it carried a warning. Back in the car, the silence between them felt different. There was no hatred, only tension, as if two worlds were quietly studying each other. Lorenzo finally spoke. "You shouldn't provoke my men," Julia answered without hesitation. "They need to learn what respect means." He stared at her for a few seconds, then looked away. But the slight curve at the corner of his mouth betrayed something. Pride. That night, dinner was silent. The servants watched from a distance, sensing the shift in power. Julia no longer lowered her eyes. She no longer asked permission to exist. And Lorenzo, who always commanded every room he entered, now watched the space being shared, an invisible territory forming between them. As they ate, the rain returned, tapping softly against the windows. The world outside looked too clean for what was happening inside. Julia raised her glass, and for a moment their eyes met. It was brief but intense. No words, just a quiet recognition of strength. After dinner, she climbed the stairs alone. The hallway felt shorter now, less intimidating. The walls that once seemed hostile now stood as silent witnesses to something new. In her room, she looked at her reflection, a woman who no longer belonged to anyone. The flame that had been born in that warehouse now burned in every movement she made. In the following days, the change spread through the house. The servants began to look at her differently, with respect. They spoke softly, but the rumors grew. "The boss's wife isn't weak," Lorenzo noticed. And though his demeanor stayed controlled, something in his eyes had changed, a trace of curiosity, perhaps even admiration. One rainy afternoon, Julia went down to the garden. The cold wind brushed her face, and the grey sky seemed to understand her. Lorenzo appeared behind her, silent, watching. "Why don't you run?" he asked, testing her instinct. Julia didn't turn around. "Because I don't want to run. I want to understand why you chose me." He didn't answer. This silence wasn't dominance. It was doubt. The man who controlled everything suddenly seemed to lose control of his own words. Julia noticed. It was the first crack in Lorenzo Vitali's armor. Small, but enough for her to see that even his empire could bleed. That night, alone in her room, she remembered what he'd said on their wedding day. "A queen doesn't cry." For the first time, those words didn't hurt. They felt like a promise. She whispered them softly, almost like a prayer. "A queen doesn't cry." And then she smiled, because she was beginning to believe it. The wind swept through the mansion, and inside her heart, something shifted. The fear that once ruled her now bowed before her courage. Julia could taste her own strength, and for the first time, the world felt smaller than she was. That night, Lorenzo sat awake in the living room, his whiskey untouched, his gaze distant. He thought about Julia, not as possession, but as presence, and it unsettled him. The power he'd always used to control others was now dissolving under her eyes. The clock struck midnight. Upstairs, Julia watched the city lights through the window. Out there, the world seemed distant, but inside her, everything had become clear. The spark had ignited, and nothing would ever be the same again. That night marked the end of fear and the beginning of something Lorenzo Vitali couldn't yet name, something the world would one day call dangerous love. The restaurant was almost empty, bathed in the soft glow of a golden sunset that spilled through the windows. The faint clinking of silverware blended with the low hum of music, and the scent of aged wine lingered in the air like a memory that refused to fade. Julia entered without haste, her posture steady, her eyes calm. She already knew there would be no turning back. In the corner, at a small reserved table, sat Elena. Her hands trembled around a glass of wine, her expression a fragile mix of guilt and exhaustion. The woman Julia once called mother was now only a shadow of the past. Their meeting began with silence, thick, heavy, almost sacred. Elena tried to smile, but the gesture collapsed halfway. Julia sat down slowly, her gaze fixed on her. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice calm, almost too calm for the depth of the wound it carried. Elena lowered her eyes, swirling the wine she couldn't bring herself to drink. I didn't have a choice," she whispered. Julia's fingers touched the table, steadying herself as if holding the world in place. "Every traitor says that." The words cut through the air like glass. Elena inhaled sharply, her chest tightening as she spoke again, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. I owed money to the Vitali family. They were going to kill me, Lorenzo. He offered me a way out. He asked for you in exchange." The confession fell from her lips like something rotten, long hidden, now finally exposed. For a moment, time stopped. Julia didn't move. Her pulse pounded in her temples, but her face remained unreadable. Inside, she could feel the quiet collapse of everything that once made sense. The childhood affection, the Christmas mornings, the promises that used to mean safety. All of it turned to dust. "So as the price of your life," she said finally, her voice steady but hollow. Elena reached out to touch her hand, but Julia drew back, the gesture small yet final. "I did it for you," Elena insisted, tears streaming down her face. "I knew Lorenzo wouldn't hurt you." Julia let out a dry laugh, one without warmth or sound. "You did it for yourself. I was just the payment." The waiter approached, but Julia raised her hand, a silent command. No witnesses. Pain didn't need an audience. Elena sobbed quietly, her face collapsing under the weight of regret. "He promised he'd take care of you," she whispered. Julia's voice was soft, but sharp enough to cut. "Take care. That's what cowards say when they want to feel less guilty." The silence that followed was unbearable. The bond between them, already frayed, broke completely, falling apart between untouched plates and ruined memories. Outside, thunder rolled across a darkening sky. Julia stood, adjusted her coat, and spoke in a low, steady tone. "You should have let me die free. Elena." Her aunt tried to rise but couldn't. Her sobs filled the room, faint and desperate, while Julia walked away without looking back. Rain met her at the door. Each drop hit the pavement in rhythm with her heartbeat. Every step she took erased a piece of her old life. The girl who once believed in promises was gone. What remained was a woman born from the wreckage. The same love that once protected her had now been the weapon that betrayed her. A black car waited outside. The driver opened the door and Julia entered without a word. Her reflection in the window looked back at her, a face she barely recognized, one stripped of innocence and fear. Lorenzo sat beside her, silent, studying her with that unreadable expression he always wore. "You found out," he said at last. "She sold me," Julia replied softly, still looking out the window. The words were calm, but carried the weight of a lifetime. Lorenzo didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was low, almost thoughtful. "Now you understand why the world doesn't forgive the weak." Julia closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Maybe he was right. Or maybe it was just another lie, one told with the ease of truth. Back at the mansion, she went straight to the studio. The smell of paint and turpentine filled the air. Julia picked up a brush and began to paint with trembling hands, strokes of anger, color, and silence. Reds, blacks, golds. Each motion was a scream disguised as art. Elena's face appeared on the canvas. then dissolved into abstract shapes and shadows. The painting became a confession, a wound and a cure, both at once. Hours later, Lorenzo entered quietly. He watched her work without speaking, his eyes lingering on the canvas. "It's beautiful," he said finally. "It hurts, but it's beautiful." Julia didn't look at him. Her hands were still shaking. He approached slowly, his voice low. "She didn't deserve to raise you." Julia gave a bitter smile. "And you think you do?" The question hung between them, heavy and unanswerable. Lorenzo didn't speak. He stepped back, letting her be. In his eyes, there was something new, not dominance, not pity, something closer to respect, maybe even guilt. He seemed to realize that Julia no longer belonged to anyone, not even him. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind battered the windows, whispering fragments of old voices. In her dreams, she saw Elena young again, calling her inside from the rain. Julia woke with tears in her eyes, but this time they carried no weakness, only release. The past, she realized, could not be erased, but it no longer defined her. When morning came, she went down for breakfast. Lorenzo was already at the table, reading the newspaper, pretending life was normal. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Better than you'd think," she replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. There was something different in her tone. Strength, distance, a hint of irony. Lorenzo noticed, but stayed silent. He only watched, aware that something irreversible had begun. Julia rose, put on her coat, and before leaving, looked at him one last time. "From now on," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable, "I choose what I remember." Lorenzo looked up, but she was already walking away. The echo of her heels filled the corridor, steady, deliberate, like the rhythm of a new beginning. Outside, the morning sky stretched clear over Rome. For the first time, Julia didn't feel cold. The weight of blood, betrayal, and broken promises began to fade. The pain was still there, but now it carried purpose. The past had exacted its price, and she was finally ready to collect. The sound of the piano drifted through the mansion like a restrained lament, each note searching for a heart that no longer existed. Julia stood in the main hall, surrounded by expensive paintings and invisible eyes. Since the confrontation with Elena, the world had become sharper, but also crueler. Pain had become her constant companion, shaping every breath, every movement. Innocence had died, and in its place something new was being born, steady, cold, untouchable. The maids whispered whenever she passed. Some still despised her, others had begun to admire her in silence. Julia noticed, but didn't react. She had learned that respect wasn't asked for, it was earned. Art became her refuge. She spent hours before her canvases, painting what she could never say out loud. Dark tones, sharp strokes, each one a quiet exorcism. One afternoon Lorenzo appeared without warning. He leaned against the doorway, his expression unreadable, watching her. "You paint like someone fighting her own ghosts," he said. Julia didn't turn. Maybe because they never leave me alone. He didn't insist. He just stayed there, silent. And for the first time that silence didn't frighten her. That night the mansion filled with powerful guests, politicians, mobsters, and their bored wives. Julia sat beside Lorenzo, flawless in her black dress, her posture perfect, her eyes steady. The air smelled of expensive wine and pretense. Laughter rehearsed, words calculated, and in the middle of it all sat the boss's wife, the woman everyone looked at but few dared to face. A socialite leaned in with a polite smile that hid a blade. So young. It must be hard learning what it means to be a true Mrs. Vitali. The table chuckled softly. Lorenzo said nothing. Julia lifted her gaze and replied, calm and clear, "Some women are born to be ladies. Others are born to redefine the word." The room went still. The laughter froze. And Lorenzo allowed himself a faint smile. As the chatter slowly returned, Julia realized something. Humiliation no longer had power over her. Every cruel remark had become fuel. Shame had turned into armor, and within it she was growing stronger. They still saw a captive, but what was truly emerging was a queen learning the weight of her own crown. After dinner, Lorenzo followed her down the hallway. "You've learnt too fast," he said, leaning casually against the wall. "Learning is all I have left," she replied. He watched her closely, his eyes shadowed with something he couldn't name. Respect, desire, fear, maybe all three. The air thickened between them. Julia walked past, her perfume brushing against his as she moved. For an instant their bodies nearly touched, but she didn't stop. She kept walking, and for the first time Lorenzo realized he wasn't the one setting the pace anymore. In the days that followed, Julia began to claim her space. She reviewed documents, attended meetings, listened in silence, and learned how the Vitali Empire truly functioned. Lorenzo didn't stop her. He knew it was useless. The woman who once barely dared to speak now commanded the room with a single glance. Power was beginning to acknowledge her, and so was his empire. Still, there were nights when the past returned. Dreams of Elena's voice, the laughter at that cruel dinner, the forged signature. When that happened, Julia rose quietly and went to the studio. The paintings were no longer dark. The colors had changed, bolder, cleaner. The hate inside her was transforming into something else, something far more dangerous: pride. One morning, as she descended the staircase, she overheard Lorenzo speaking with one of his men. "She's changing the atmosphere in this house," he said. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Julia pretended not to hear, but her heart quickened. The most feared man in Italy was being moved, not by power, but by her calm. Time passed slowly inside the mansion. Every sound, every look, every silence seemed to carry meaning. Julia learned that power didn't need to shout. It simply existed. And she began to use it as he did. Not to dominate, but to survive. One afternoon, in the garden, she crossed paths with the same woman who had mocked her at dinner. The woman tried again to provoke her, but Julia smiled faintly and said, "Careful when laughing at someone still learning. One day I might be the one laughing." Her tone was soft, almost kind, but her words carried promise. That night, Lorenzo sat on the veranda, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, watching her from a distance. "A queen doesn't cry," he said, repeating his old phrase. Julia turned slightly, her voice low but steady. "A queen doesn't need to." He exhaled slowly, as if surrendering something invisible. And for a moment, the Vitali Empire felt smaller than the power in her gaze. Julia climbed the stairs with quiet confidence. The fear, the shame, the anger, all of it had become memory. What remained was strength, calm and undeniable. Standing before the mirror, she smiled for the first time without guilt. The woman reflected there was no longer a victim. She was destiny. The wind slipped through the open window, making the curtains dance. Outside, the sky stretched in shades of grey and gold. Julia felt it in her chest. Something was shifting. The empire might still belong to Lorenzo, but the story, from this moment on, belonged to her. Footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway. Power approaching, not to cage her, but to recognize her. Julia turned her face toward the sound, her gaze steady, her voice barely a whisper. "Let them laugh. One day they'll bow." And as the clock marked the slow hours of the night, the woman who had been born from chaos began her transformation. Not into a victim, not even into a survivor, but into a legend. The mansion was wrapped in the stillness of midnight, the kind of silence that hides more than it reveals. Every light was out except one, the faint glow of a single lamp inside the studio. Julia hadn't slept. She stood before the canvas, her hand moving slowly, the sound of the brush the only heartbeat left in the house. Outside, rain whispered against the glass, soft and constant, like old memories asking to be heard. It was there, in that fragile quiet, that David appeared, one of Lorenzo's most loyal men, the kind who blended with the shadows and never spoke unless it mattered. He entered without knocking, his coat damp, an envelope clutched in his hand. You should see this, he said simply, placing it on the table. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, heavy with something unspoken. Julia frowned. Why are you giving me this? David hesitated, his voice low. Because it might change what you think about him. Then he left, the sound of the door closing echoing through the room like a warning. Julia stared at the envelope for a long time before touching it. Her fingertips brushed the edges, as if afraid it might burn. When she finally opened it, an old photograph slid out, faded, fragile, alive with ghosts. A young boy stared back at her, his eyes dark and full of loss. Next to him stood a little girl, her. The same scar beneath the chin, the same eyes searching for something beyond the frame. For a second, she couldn't breathe. The realization came like a storm. Lorenzo, the boy in the picture was Lorenzo. Her hands trembled as the world seemed to tilt. Fragments of memory flashed through her mind, a cold night, gunfire, someone carrying her through the dark. She had always thought it was a dream. Now it was proof. The man who destroyed her life had once saved it. She sank to the floor, the photograph trembling between her fingers. The confusion was too heavy to name, love and hate merging into a single pulse that burned through her chest. Outside, thunder split the sky and she whispered into the emptiness, "What did you do to me?" The tears came quietly, unnoticed, like the rain outside. When morning arrived, light invaded the mansion without permission. Julia found Lorenzo in the library, calm, collected, pretending not to feel the storm approaching. She held the photograph like a weapon. "What is this?" Her voice was cold, steady. He looked up, his eyes tired. "Something I hoped you'd never remember." The words struck like a blade. Julia stepped closer, her heart beat sharp and loud. "You knew me before all this. Before the lie." Lorenzo exhaled slowly, the mask slipping. "I pulled you out of a war you don't remember," he said. "The debt your aunt owed wasn't where it started. It was where it ended. I found you once, and I should have left you free. But I didn't. I brought you back into a world you were never meant to see again." His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of a confession. Julia stared at him, unable to tell where truth ended and guilt began. "You could have told me." He met her eyes, steady, almost tender. "If I told you, you would have stayed. And I didn't deserve that." The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Julia turned away, her voice breaking. "So that's what this is? You lock me in this golden cage because you don't know how to love?" Lorenzo took a step closer, his tone quiet but certain. "I keep you because when I let you go, I lose whatever soul I have left." For a heartbeat, time stopped. Their eyes met, and the distance between them dissolved. He lifted a hand, slow and hesitant, as if touching her might destroy the last fragile piece of redemption left in him. "I recognized you the moment I saw you," he murmured. "I just didn't know if you came back to save me or to ruin me." Julia's breath trembled as she stepped back. The ground felt uncertain beneath her. The story she thought she knew had shattered, and somewhere in the wreckage, something else was being born. "I don't know what you want from me, Lorenzo," she said softly. "I just want you to hate me less than I deserve," he answered. The rest of the day unfolded in silence. Julia returned to the studio, the photograph still in her hand. She tried to paint, but the colors wouldn't obey. The strokes blurred into chaos, the image of his face appearing and vanishing with every layer. He was both savior and destroyer, love and wound. When night fell again, she stepped out onto the balcony. The wind was cold and alive, carrying the sound of the distant sea. Lorenzo joined her, wordless, his presence quiet but heavy. They stood side by side, two souls bound by something neither could name. "If I truly hated you," she said at last, eyes fixed on the horizon, "I would have run. And if you truly loved me," he answered, his voice barely above the wind, "you wouldn't be able to stay. Julia smiled faintly, almost sadly. Then we're both condemned. He looked at her, his expression softening. Or maybe we're finally being forgiven. The moon broke through the clouds, bathing them in silver light. For a fleeting moment the world seemed suspended, as if even fate was holding its breath. They didn't know what would come next. But one truth was certain. What tied them together now was neither hatred nor desire. It was something far deeper, born from the same silence that had once broken them. And as the night wind brushed her face, Julia felt something shift inside her, a quiet certainty, a whisper of destiny. After so much darkness, it felt as if the story between them was only just beginning to speak. The hall pulsed with quiet tension, filled with murmurs and restrained laughter. The elite of the underworld had gathered that night, bosses, allies, and traitors dressed as friends. Julia entered beside Lorenzo, her black dress gliding across the floor like a living shadow. Every eye turned toward her, not as a wife, but as a piece on a dangerous board. The air was thick, heavy with promises and unspoken threats. Luca Bellini was there, Lorenzo's rival, charming, venomous, and always smiling just before he struck. When Julia passed, he raised his glass and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Beautiful acquisition, Vitali. Must have cost you a fortune." The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Julia stopped walking. Her gaze met his, calm, sharp, deadly. She breathed in slowly before replying, her tone cold but even. "Funny, I thought filth was your territory." The words hit like glass shattering. A few chuckled nervously, others simply froze. Luca's smirk faltered. His eyes darkened. "Careful, girl. Words can kill." Julia didn't flinch. Better that than dying silent. The air shifted. Lorenzo's face didn't move, but his presence filled the room like thunder waiting to strike. He rose from his chair, each step deliberate, slow, the kind that made hearts skip. When he stopped in front of Luca, the tension was electric. "Touch her," he said quietly, "and you die." Luca's attempt at laughter died in his throat. Lorenzo turned to Julia, and before anyone could react, he pulled her close. His hands framed her face, rough and certain, and his mouth crashed against hers. The kiss was violent, consuming, not affection, but fire. It was anger, confession, and warning all at once. And for a moment, Julia didn't resist. Her heart burned in time with her defiance. When the kiss broke, silence consumed the room. Lorenzo's voice cut through it, steady and sharp. "Now everyone knows," he said. "She's my wife. No one touches what's mine." The statement was less protection, more declaration of war. Luca stepped back, the fury in his eyes cold and poisonous. Julia saw it, the beginning of vengeance. The game had changed. The rest of the evening passed like a fever dream. Conversation returned, laughter resumed, but the air never recovered. Julia sat beside Lorenzo again, her hands trembling beneath the table. The taste of him lingered, a mix of fury, danger, and something she couldn't name. Something that frightened her because it felt too real. When the night ended, Lorenzo escorted her to the car. Neither spoke. The silence between them was alive, dense with what neither dared to admit. Both knew something irreversible had happened. He was no longer just the man who caged her, and she was no longer the woman who obeyed. There was fire now, and it burned on both sides of the bars. Back at the mansion, Lorenzo held the door open, letting her step inside first. The sound of her heels echoed across the marble floor. "You shouldn't have done that," Julia said, her voice firm. "I should have," he answered. "They needed to understand who you are." She turned, anger simmering behind her calm. "And what am I, Lorenzo? A trophy? A warning?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "No, a danger." The word hung between them like a spark refusing to die. Julia's gaze was steady, challenging. "You don't know who I am," she said. Lorenzo smiled faintly, almost tired. "I know enough to be afraid." Her pulse quickened. The space between them charged. And in that moment she understood. His fear wasn't of her. It was of himself. In the following days, the kiss became legend. Whispers filled the mansion, spreading beyond its walls. Allies spoke in secret, enemies watched from a distance. Giulia was no longer just a name. She was a symbol. The woman who had faced Luca Bellini and survived. The wife no one dared provoke. And Lorenzo, caught between pride and regret, watched as the empire began to shift around her. One afternoon, David returned. "Bellini's gathering allies," he said quietly. "He wants to humiliate you the way you humiliated him." Giulia didn't react. She simply turned toward the rain falling against the window. "Then let him come," she whispered. "This time I won't wait for Lorenzo to speak for me." The glint in her eyes was new, sharp, dangerous, alive. That night Lorenzo entered her room without warning. "You shouldn't provoke this war," he said. "You started it," she answered. "I just learned to fight your way." He moved closer, his voice lowering. "And if I lose you in this fight?" She met his eyes, unflinching. "Then you'll finally know what it feels like to be me." Something broke in his expression. The boss disappeared, and for a heartbeat, only the man remained. "You don't understand, Giulia. I'd kill for you." Her gaze hardened. "And that's exactly why you'll never understand what love is." The silence that followed was heavier than anger. It was sorrow, sharp and quiet. He left without another word. The door closed slowly behind him, and the air trembled with things left unsaid. Giulia stood before the mirror. Her reflection split between fury and something softer. Her lips still burned, not from the kiss, but from what it meant. The war had begun, and the battlefield was their hearts. The next morning, she came down the grand staircase wearing the same black dress, her hair loose, her eyes clear. The servants paused when she passed. No one knew whether to fear her or admire her. Giulia no longer looked like a captive. She looked inevitable. From across the room, Lorenzo watched. His gaze was no longer possessive. It was surrender. He understood now that the woman he once tried to control had become something untouchable, and somehow, without realizing it, he had become her prisoner. Outside, the sun rose red over Rome, painting the sky like a warning. Giulia stepped onto the balcony, the wind brushing her face. "A kiss started the war," she whispered. "But it'll be blood that decides who wins." And in that moment, love and danger became the same thing. The night was heavy and hot, carrying the kind of silence that comes before a tragedy. The mansion seemed to hold its breath as Giulia walked through the corridors, her senses sharpening with every step. Something in the air had shifted, a weight, a warning, a premonition she couldn't name. The wind that passed through the open windows carried whispers instead of air. Lorenzo was in his office, locked away in one of his endless meetings, and for the first time in days, she was alone. Her power had grown, and with it, so had the danger. Davida appeared in the doorway of the studio, his face grave, his eyes avoiding hers. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Giulia followed him into the garden, where the distant hum of the city mixed with the chirping of crickets. "It's your aunt," he began. "Elena. She's alive." For a heartbeat, Giulia couldn't move. "She was seen with Luca Bellini." The words struck like a blade. Her world tilted. "That's impossible," she whispered. David shook his head. "She sold information. Your schedule, the house, your security, even you." The wind lifted her hair as if mocking the stillness that followed. "Why?" she asked. "Money," he said softly, "and revenge. She says you took everything that belonged to her." The pain arrived slowly, cold and deliberate. Her veins felt like they were turning to steel. Without hesitation, Giulia stormed toward Lorenzo's office. She pushed the door open so hard it struck the wall. "Elena's alive," she said, "and she's with Bellini." Lorenzo looked up from his papers, his expression calm but his eyes betraying the shock. "Who told you that?" "David." He closed the file, stood, and simply said, "Then the war has begun." And just like that, he left. No explanation, no promise, only silence and the echo of his footsteps. Julia stood there for a long time, the sound of engines roaring in the distance as his men disappeared into the night. The rain began to fall, slow at first, then steady. The clock on the wall ticked like a heartbeat out of rhythm. For the first time, she didn't know if he'd come back. She held the silver necklace he'd given her months ago, the only act of tenderness in a history built on fire, and whispered, "I won't hide." But fate didn't wait. A thunderclap split the sky, the lights flickered, and then came the sound. Footsteps, many of them. Fast. Determined. Men with covered faces stormed the hall without hesitation. Chaos erupted. Julia ran, but a blow caught her side, sending her crashing to the floor. The world blurred into noise and shadow, the metallic taste of blood, the smell of gasoline and gunpowder. And before everything went dark, a voice broke through the storm. "Hello, Queen, Luca Bellini." When she woke, she was tied to a chair in a warehouse that reeked of rust and sweat. Bright lights, cameras, laughter. Luca stood before her, his face marked by old scars, his smile unhinged. "Welcome to your own little show," he said. "Vitali made you a queen, but tonight the world will see what you really are, a bargaining chip." He lifted a phone. Its camera pointed straight at her. Julia inhaled slowly. She didn't cry. "You're really going to get revenge on a man by using a woman?" she asked, her tone steady. Luca chuckled. "No. I'm going to destroy him by proving his woman is weak." She looked up, eyes clear, unblinking. "Then you're about to lose twice." The slap came fast, sharp, but she didn't turn away. Across the city, Lorenzo watched the broadcast. Julia's image flickered on the screen, blood on her lip, defiance in her voice. His pulse turned to thunder. "Get the cars," he ordered. No one dared to argue. Everyone knew what it meant when Lorenzo Vitali went alone. Back in the warehouse, Julia played her only card. "You know he's coming," she said. Luca smirked. "That's the idea. I want him to see what's left of his precious wife. Then let me talk to him," she said evenly. "Let him see me live, see what you've done. Isn't that what you want, Luca? An audience?" He hesitated, tempted. "And why should I let you?" "Because you love a stage," she answered, her voice cutting through the air like steel wrapped in silk. The plan formed between breaths. As Luca set up the live feed, she studied everything. Exits, guards, weapons, cameras. Every second mattered. The pain grounded her, but her mind stayed sharp. When the camera light blinked red, she looked straight into the lens. "I told you the underworld had many doors," she whispered. "I just opened another one." Lorenzo understood instantly. Outside, engines roared as his convoy surrounded the building. The first explosion shattered the silence, followed by gunfire and screams. Inside, Julia used the distraction, twisting her wrists until the ropes burned loose. She grabbed a metal rod from the floor and stood, breath ragged, eyes clear. The chaos outside had found its echo within. Luca turned to flee, but she was already there. "You thought you could use me to hurt him?" she said, voice low and deadly. "I'm not the wound, Luca, I'm the weapon." He raised his gun, but before he could pull the trigger, a single shot rang out. Lorenzo stood behind him, smoke curling from his pistol. Luca's body dropped, and silence filled the room again. Julia stood still, the rod still clenched in her hand, her eyes dry, her heart steady. Lorenzo approached slowly, his voice rough. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "I'm not someone who needs saving anymore, Lorenzo," she said. "I'm someone who fights beside you." He looked at her for a long moment before a faint, tired smile crossed his lips. "Then it's done." Julia's gaze flickered toward Luca's body. "No," she said quietly. "It's only beginning." The camera was still recording. The feed was live. Across the world, the image spread. Lorenzo Vitali and Julia side by side, their faces shadowed and fierce. The empire had a new symbol, not just a king, but a queen who ruled beside him. The fear that once haunted her now belonged to someone else. And as the screen faded to black, the legend began, written not in ink, but in fire and blood. Dawn arrived like a silent confession. The city still slept, but the underworld was already awake, whispering one name through its veins. Giulia Vitali. The footage of the rescue had spread everywhere, she, bloodied yet unbroken, standing tall amid chaos. And Lorenzo, wounded but unyielding, beside her. It wasn't just news. It was the birth of a legend. The mansion buzzed with murmurs. Men who once served Lorenzo now bowed to them both. Power had shifted, subtly, inevitably. Lorenzo stood by the window, his shirt undone, the faint scar on his shoulder catching the light. He watched her dress before the mirror, calm, composed, untouchable. "Know they respect you," he said quietly. Giulia's reflection met his eyes. "Respect is easy," she replied. "What I want is a voice." That night, the leaders of the 5 families were summoned. The meeting would take place in the old theatre, the one where the Vitali dynasty had forged alliances and betrayed kings. Giulia entered with Lorenzo at her side, wrapped in black and gold, mourning and majesty intertwined. The echo of her heels filled the vast room. Every glance that met hers was a test, every breath a challenge. When the couple reached the center table, men rose, some out of respect, others out of fear. Giulia felt it. She didn't flinch. She sat beside Lorenzo, her back straight, her eyes steady. The head of the Moretti family was the first to speak. "The Vitali Empire has gone soft," he said, smirking. Laughter rippled, cautious, calculated. Lorenzo didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the dagger lying on the table, drew a clean cut across his palm, and extended his hand toward her. "My empire is hers," he declared, his voice low but thunderous. Blood pooled between his fingers. Giulia held his gaze and without hesitation mirrored his act. Their hands met. The oath was sealed in red. The silence that followed was sacred. The room had shifted from mockery to awe. Giulia looked around, her tone calm but unyielding. "This empire no longer survives on fear," she said. "It stands on loyalty. And whoever wants power must learn respect first." Her words cut sharper than the dagger. One of Bellini's former allies rose, sneering. "You speak boldly for someone who exists only because he allowed it." Giulia didn't blink. "And you speak boldly for someone who should already be on his knees." The man froze. No one laughed this time. Even Lorenzo stayed silent because she no longer needed defense. Power had found a new voice. When the meeting ended, the theatre emptied, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the scent of iron and dust. Lorenzo and Giulia stood beneath the faded chandelier, the light filtering through cracked windows, painting their faces in gold and shadow. "Now they fear you," he said quietly. "No," she answered. "Now they see me." He gave a faint smile. "Seeing you. That's what's always terrified me." She walked to the center of the stage, her heels echoing like the heartbeat of fate. Memories surfaced, the forced marriage, the nights of silence, the endless struggle for control. All of it seemed distant now. "Power doesn't heal," she murmured. "It teaches." Lorenzo stepped closer. "And what did it teach you?" She turned toward him, her eyes steady. "That strength isn't about winning. It's about standing when everything inside you has already fallen." He leaned forward until their foreheads touched, a fragile peace in the middle of a storm. "You were never meant to be here," he whispered. "But I am," she replied softly. "And as long as I am, the name Vitali won't mean fear. It'll mean respect." For once, Lorenzo had no words. In the days that followed, the empire changed rhythm. Giulia began leading meetings, rewriting alliances, reshaping the kingdom Lorenzo had built with iron. People started calling her La Regina Silenziosa, the Silent Queen. The name spread like wildfire, echoing through the streets, whispered in alleyways, feared in the dreams of men. But power has its price. At night, alone in her room, Giulia could still feel the weight of blood on her hands. The ghosts of Elena, Bellini, and even Lorenzo haunted her thoughts. The throne she sat upon was carved from scars. She understood now. Power was never a gift, it was a sentence. At a dinner days later, one of the crime lords raised his glass, his tone sharp. "Even queens fall," he said. Julia smiled faintly, her eyes glinting over the rim of her wineglass. "Yes," she said softly. "But the ones who know how to fall learn how to rise faster." The table fell silent. Lorenzo across the room watched her, pride and fear warring quietly in his gaze. Later that night, when the mansion had gone still, Julia descended to the grand hall. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, silvering the marble floor. She walked to the ancient mirror that bore the Vitali crest and traced it with her fingertips. "I was the price of a debt," she whispered. "Now I'm the one who collects." Lorenzo's voice came from behind her, rough, tired. "You don't have to carry all of it alone." She turned to him, her face calm but resolute. "Power can't be shared, Lorenzo. It can only be endured." He nodded slowly, knowing she was right. And in that moment, he finally understood. The empire was no longer his. It belonged to her. Outside, the storm began. Thunder cracked across the horizon, lightning flooding the windows in white fire. Julia didn't move. She stared at her reflection, at the woman who had risen from ruin. The girl she once was had vanished. What stood there now was legend, blood, and redemption intertwined. And as thunder rolled through the night, she whispered to herself, almost smiling, "Power didn't save me. It taught me to never need saving again." Night fell heavy with omens. The wind howled across the city, carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder. From the mansion balcony, Julia watched the skyline, every light flickering like a warning. The empire looked calm, but calm was always a lie. The past never dies quietly. It waits. And that night, it came back, with blood in its eyes. A single phone call shattered the stillness. David answered, his face draining of color. "He's alive," he said. Lorenzo looked up slowly. "Who?" The answer came like an echo from the underworld. "Luca Bellini." The wound they thought had healed tore open again. Julia's breath caught in her throat. Lorenzo stood, his voice controlled, cold. "Where?" Davida hesitated. "Near the border. He's gathering men. And a plan." The hours that followed were drowned in silence. Lorenzo prepared like a man walking toward his own funeral. Julia stood by the door, torn between fear and fury. "You don't have to go," she said softly. "I do," he replied, slipping on his gloves. "I need to finish what I started." But she knew. This wasn't just revenge. It was fate coming for what it was owed. When morning came, the bed beside her was empty. The sheet still held his warmth, and on the pillow lay the silver necklace he had once given her, the only fragment of tenderness left between them. She picked it up, fastening it around her neck. "If he falls," she whispered, "he won't fall alone." And with that, she left. The road to the border was wrapped in fog. Each turn felt like a warning from heaven itself. Her hands gripped the wheel, her heart beat steady but fierce. When she reached the abandoned warehouse, the air was alive with gunfire. The metallic taste of vengeance filled the rain. Inside, Lorenzo fought, outnumbered, bleeding, but unbroken. Julia ran toward him, but a shadow moved faster. Luca stepped from the dark, his face carved with scars, his eyes burning with hatred. "The queen comes to watch her king fall," he sneered. Lorenzo tried to lift his gun, but his strength faltered. Julia stepped between them. "Kill me and you lose everything," she said. Luca laughed, a sound too human to be sane. "Then let's see what matters more, the empire or love." He pulled the trigger. The sound split the air, but the shot didn't come from his gun. Lorenzo had fired first. The world froze. Luca stumbled back, blood blooming against his chest, and fell as the rain poured through the broken ceiling. Lorenzo swayed, and Julia caught him in her arms. "Why?" she cried. He looked at her, a faint smile trembling on his lips. "Because I never had to choose between you and the Empire," he whispered. "You are my empire." The storm raged outside, sirens wailing in the distance. Julia held him close, her tears mixing with the rain. "You won," he breathed, the light fading from his eyes. "No, Lorenzo," she said, her voice breaking. "We won." By dawn, the city was quiet again. The name Vitali no longer carried fear, only reverence. Julia took the reins of the empire, ruling not from cruelty, but from strength carved out of survival. The throne she claimed was not inherited. It was earned. A year later, the old theatre had been restored. Julia stood on its stage wearing white, the color of peace and ghosts. The same place that once bound her now set her free. The audience seats were empty, filled only with echoes and the whisper of the wind. She closed her eyes and spoke softly into the silence. "I'm no longer the girl who woke up in a bed of fear. I'm Julia Vitali. I've been to hell and back, and I'm still standing. In the shadows of the stage, a child played with a silver necklace, Lorenzo's son." He looked up at his mother, and she smiled. For the first time, love didn't hurt. It simply existed. The lights dimmed. Rain began to fall against the roof, gentle this time, as if blessing what remained. Julia lifted her gaze toward the sky. "Power taught me how to survive," she whispered, "but love taught me how to live." And under that same restless sky that once watched her break, Julia Vitali was reborn. Subscribe and turn on notifications to follow the next stories of intense romance, power, and redemption.